In the early 19th century, stories emerged of mysterious ruins that lay buried and forgotten deep inside the jungles of Central America. But a lost civilization in this region was thought to be impossible in the 1800s. Everyone knew that the continent had only ever been peopled by savages. But they couldn't have created such sophisticated structures. Someone else must have done it.
So Egyptians or Asians had come to Central America and built these ruins and then left again.
But then an American lawyer named John Lloyd Stephens and a British artist, Frederick Catherwood, went to see these ruins for themselves.
An artist and a lawyer go into a jungle. I mean, how more preposterous can it be?
They traveled hundreds of miles through the jungles of Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras to search for the ruins. Eventually, they uncovered the remains of 44 cities.
It was extraordinarily exciting for them because they knew they'd found something the world had never seen before.
With their astonishing discoveries, the two amateur explorers overturned everything we thought we knew about the history of the New World. This is the amazing story of how Stephens and Catherwood discovered one of the world's greatest civilizations, the Maya. John Lloyd Stephens was born to a prosperous New Jersey family in 1805. He was classically educated, a trained lawyer, and a rising Democratic Party politician. And so he might have remained, but for a chance event. During a mayoral campaign in 1834, Stephens's voice became so hoarse with public speaking that he developed a serious throat infection. His doctor advised an immediate change of climate. Stephens took his doctor at his word. He enjoyed the thrill of traveling around Europe and the Middle East, writing about his adventures amongst the ruins of the Old World.
By the mid-1830s, he goes to Egypt and the Holy Land. He travels to Greece and Poland and Russia, and he really takes to it. He seems to have a real talent for travel writing.
On his way back to New York, Stephens stopped off in London in 1836. Here, he met Frederick Catherwood, a well-known British artist.
Catherwood was trained as an architect to begin with, so he understands buildings, he understands structure. And then he goes to the Royal Academy schools in London and trains as an artist.
Catherwood studied under some of the greatest masters of his time. Turner gave him lessons on perspective. Others taught him how to draw buildings, and Catherwood became a highly accomplished architectural painter. Like Stephens, Catherwood had traveled to many of the great ruins of Europe in the Middle East between 1821 and 1832.
Stephens and Catherwood acquired, really, very extensive knowledge, both of them, of the kind of archaeology that was known about at that time in the Old World.
While Stephens had written about these ancient worlds, Catherwood had painted their ruins in great detail. But then, Stevens and Catherwood would hear rumors of a new world civilization, which would define the path they would follow for the rest of their lives.
They come together and discuss what is just about on the radar at the time, and this is these curious remnants of some sort of ancient civilization in Central America.
Catherwood showed Stevens an intriguing book called Descriptions of an Ancient City. Published in 1822, it displayed illustrations of ruins with palaces and pyramids covered with characters and symbols in a mysterious place called Palenque in southern Mexico.
Catherwood showed him a series of books. One of them provided quite an avid description of Palenque, but had decided that, like so many scholars of the time, that it couldn't have been the native Indians that had created these ruins.
The idea that there had ever been a Native American civilization deep in the jungles of Central America was unthinkable to many in the 1800s.
Indigenous Indians could not have built these ruins, could not have built such great palaces, and they were magnificent palaces for a culture that never moved beyond stone tools.
Indians, according to historians of the day, were thought to be savage and primitive, and not capable of building such sophisticated cities. The view was that the ruins at Palenque must have been the work of other cultures.
They must have been an ancient culture from across the sea. So Egyptians or Asians had come to Central America and built these ruins and then left again.
The reason for this view was that historians had very fixed ideas. Critically, they believed all civilizations had to conform to a certain set of rules.
In the 1830s, I mean, Stevens and Catherwood, when talking about civilization, would define it in terms of cities and impressive-looking architecture. Evidence of rulers and rule, complex kind of agricultural systems, a writing system.
And then there is time for people to be artists, to sculpt monuments, to study the sciences, travel, trade, have a wealth of goods, have teachers, schools.
Everyone agreed that the primitive nomadic people of Central America couldn't have achieved anything like this. Though they weren't professional historians, Stevens and Catherwood believed that those who held that view were wrong. They could see no evidence that Egyptians and Phoenicians had ever been to Central America, and the images they were looking at were very different to anything they had seen in the Old World. They must have been made by an unknown Native American culture.
Stevens and Catherwood were extraordinarily different people. I mean, that's what makes them so marvelous as a pair, as a sort of Holmes and Watson, you know, of Maya archaeology. They could see that was evident in the New World was something very, very different.
He and Catherwood together were the first to look at these sites without the filters of thinking about Old World archaeology. Both are very much interested in these being indigenously authored sites.
These illustrations and vague accounts of a lost city aroused Stevens and Catherwood's curiosity. They decided to look further. Two years later, in 1838, Stevens got another lead. A New York bookseller showed him several more works relating to ruins in Central America. One was a large folio based on the personal explorations and illustrations of French archaeologist Jean-Frédéric Waldeck, which had just been published in Paris. These pages showed again the illustrations of the Palenque ruins in Mexico, first made known to Stevens by Catherwood. And there was more. The book also revealed illustrations of another strange ruin in Uxmal, in the Yucatan region of Mexico. Stevens then learned from the bookseller that yet a further set of ruins were said to exist in an area called Copan, in modern-day Honduras.
Stevens had read an account by a man called Juan Galindo, who'd actually been to Copan and written a description of what he'd seen there.
Monstrous figures are found among the ruins. One, a colossal alligator, having in its jaws a figure with a human face, but with the paws of an animal.
Stevens was stunned. He had now heard of 3 separate ruined cities. Palenque in southern Mexico, Uxmal in the Yucatan, and Copan in Honduras, all in the same region, but hundreds of miles apart. And who knew if there were any more? Stevens began to wonder, could these ruins be evidence that there had once been a great civilization in that region?
He is, among the first of these explorer writers to begin connecting the dots and thinking about this as a coherent civilization.
Stevens could see that there must be some connection between these ruins. And these weren't just one palace here and one palace there, completely different groups. There must have been something between them.
Back at home, Stevens became convinced he was onto something and was determined to find these 3 ruins he'd learned about: Palenque, Uxmal, and Copan. He began to plan an expedition to Central America. Because Stevens was now earning substantial royalties from his successful travel books, he invited his artist friend, Frederick Catherwood, to go with him. Stevens sent him word to get ready. The deal meant that Catherwood would illustrate any ruins they find in Central America, and Stevens would pay for it. Catherwood packed his brushes, paints, and reams of paper. He also packed machetes and pistols, as there was a real chance of trouble where they were going. British Honduras and Guatemala were in the middle of a violent border dispute, and the area was considered a very dangerous place to visit. Stevens realized that they were going to need all the help they could get. He persuaded the US President, Martin Van Buren, to appoint him as a special ambassador to Central America to help ease their way through the unstable region.
He's even given a special sort of frock coat to wear for the sort of official occasions. So he has that diplomatic mission which runs alongside the artistic and historical mission.
The only problem was, the 4 previous US ambassadors to have held this position had all died in office in Central America. Stevens received a letter from one of their widows, whose husband had died of malaria. It concluded with the ominous words, "May you be more fortunate than any of your predecessors have been." Stevens and Catherwood left New York on the 3rd of October, 1839, determined to locate the three ruins buried deep in the jungles of Central America. After a month at sea, the two explorers arrived in Belize, on the northeastern coast of Central America. Their plan was to first head towards one of the mysterious lost cities Stevens had heard about in New York. It was called Copan, and it lay in the western region of Honduras, close to the Guatemalan border. In honor of Stevens' diplomatic position, they were guests of the British governor in Belize, Colonel MacDonald, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. MacDonald warned them they were entering dangerous country, and his diplomatic pass would hold no sway with any rebel forces they may encounter. MacDonald put Stevens and Catherwood on a government steamboat and told them that if danger did threaten, they were to hang out their flag and send word to him. Then he sent them on their way with a 13-gun salute. Undaunted, they arrived on the coast of eastern Guatemala the following morning. Now the two explorers had to climb over the Mico mountain range to reach the Guatemalan border with Honduras. Once there, they would enter Honduras and go on to Copan. Stevens hired a guide who was fluent in Spanish and knew the grueling mountain pass that loomed ahead. Although only just over 4,000 feet, Mico Mountain was a treacherous route to cross. Stevens later described their experience in his book of the expedition, Incidents of Travel in Central America.
For 5 long hours, we were dragged through mud holes, squeezed in gullies, knocked against trees, and tumbled over roots. Every step required care and great physical exertion. I felt that our inglorious epitaph might be tossed over the head of a mule, framed by the trunk of a mahogany tree, and buried in the mud of Mico Mountain.
Catherwood looked at Stevens and groaned.
If I'd known of this cursed Mico Mountain before I agreed to come, you would have come to Central America alone.
Here's a guy in a jungle with guns on each hip and a sword, and in all likelihood wearing shades because he suffered from eye problems, inflammation of the iris, and there's a reference to him wearing spectacles. I mean, that picture, when you think about it, I mean, Keith Richards got nothing on that.
Over the next 2 weeks, the party hacked through jungles and traversed perilous ravines.
It was jungle, end to end jungle, with no roads or places to stop off for the night. Food was a big issue. It seemed like they lived on chocolate and cigars most of the time.
They passed hillsides with grazing cattle that reminded Stevens of rural England, were hounded by biting insects and tropical fevers. And there was also the ever-present threat of running into ruthless rebels.
People get very nasty in civil wars, and the factions were already known to have committed atrocities and massacres and whatnot, and they had a very real suspicion of foreigners.
One evening, Stevens and Catherwood set up camp in an abandoned church. As they slept, drunken soldiers burst in, brandishing swords and muskets. Stevens recalled this incident in his account of the expedition.
Here we were in the hands of men who would have been turned out of any decent state prison lest they should contaminate the other inmates. Their appearance was ferocious, and doubtless, if we had attempted to escape, they would have been glad of the excuse for murder.
Luckily, the following morning, the soldiers had sobered up. Stevens and Catherwood were allowed to continue their journey to Copan. "14 days after arriving in Belize, the two men finally reached the area of Copan. A remote jungle region, little known by locals and rarely visited by travelers. As the two explorers worked their way through the dense forest, they suddenly came to a bank of a river. Across the water, Stephen's eyes fell on a large stone wall rising out of the undergrowth. It was 100 feet high and covered in thick, constricting vines.
It had more the character of a structure than anything we had ever seen ascribed to the Aborigines of America.
Stevens and Catherwood crossed the river to investigate. Stevens would vividly describe their experience of Copan and how they first set eyes on the ruins in his book of the expedition.
I am entering abruptly a new world. It is impossible to describe the interest with which I explored these ruins. The ground was entirely new. There were no guidebooks or guides. The whole was a virgin soil. We could not see 10 yards before us and never knew what we should stumble upon next.
Stevens realized they had to clear the ruins of its tangle of jungle vines before they could really understand what lay beneath them. Just as they were about to begin, they had an unexpected problem. The local landowner appeared. Stevens explained he wanted to clear and explore the ruins and offered to buy the land.
When his host is sort of balking at the idea, the first thing that Stevens does is he opens up his trunk, pulls out his diplomatic, sort of uniform, and claims that his host was overwhelmed by his shiny, American Eagle buttons.
At last, Stephen's diplomatic status became useful. He was allowed to purchase the Copan land for $50. Now, they could set to work. The following morning, the systematic clearing of the Copan ruins began.
Copan was extraordinarily overgrown at this point, so they were seeing little bits and pieces of Copan at a time.
At one time, we stopped to cut away branches and vines, which concealed the face of a monument, and dig around and bring to light a fragment, a sculptured corner of which protruded from the earth.
It'd be like finding one statue in Egypt and not knowing yet that the pyramids were there.
We go now and we travel there now, and they look very clinical almost, because they're very nicely cut lawns and all of the trees have been taken away. But they would have seen them thoroughly immersed in jungle.
I leaned over with breathless anxiety. An eye, an ear, a foot, or a hand was disentombed. And when the machete rang against the chiseled stone, I cleared out the loose earth with my hands.
As Stevens ran the excavations, Catherwood set up his station in the jungle to record the mysterious structures they were discovering. He used a piece of equipment called a camera lucida to help him detail what he was seeing with great accuracy.
He had with him this apparatus, the camera lucida. The light came through a kind of prism and gave you an image which you could see on a piece of paper, and you could pretty much sketch it or trace it. And it was a great help to Catherwood.
Catherwood, with his incredible knowledge of architecture, must have realized right away that this was something quite unique and that he was in a unique place, qualified to record it.
As Stevens and Catherwood gradually cleared away the jungle vines, they began to unearth evidence of a very sophisticated society.
They saw fantastic little elements of sculpture which intrigued them. And then eventually, as they carried on, they began to see these very large, great big monoliths. Seeing these, which clearly convinced them that this was something, they'd never seen anything like that before.
Working our way through the thick woods, we came upon a square stone column, about 14 feet high and 3 feet on each side from the base to the top. The front was the figure of the man, curiously and richly dressed, and the face evidently a portrait. Our guide called it an idol. And before it was a large block of stone sculptured with figures, which he called an altar. The sight of this unexpected monument gave us the assurance that the objects we were in search of were interesting, not only as the remains of an unknown people, but as works of art, proving that the people who once occupied the continent of America were not savages.
Right away, you can see how open he is, because he doesn't say, oh, that's a monster or a crude representation of the devil or something. He observes that they're very complex, must have been made by very talented people.
As the days passed, Stevens and Catherwood uncovered monumental structures that could have housed hundreds of people, and building blocks that showed all the hallmarks of a great civilization. They found large squares, terraces, and platforms with stepped pyramids, temples, ceremonial buildings, and shrines with altars.
We reached a terrace so overgrown with trees that at first we could not make out its form, but which, on clearing, we ascertained to be a square, and with steps on all the sides, as perfect as those of the Roman amphitheater.
I think they really were kind of astounded once they got to Copan, the extent of the cities.
The beauty of the sculpture, the desolation of the city, and the mystery that hung over it, all created an interest higher, if possible, than I'd ever felt among the ruins of the old world.
What is amazingly sort of human and endearing of him is the way he puts it, is that he says, after a time, looking at these things, it was evident these weren't the monuments of savages. These are sophisticated people.
Now, there could be no doubt. The two amateur men had found what professional historians had said could not exist. Proof that some form of civilization had once thrived in this area. And then came something even more extraordinary. Writing. Standing at the center of the ruins, their eyes fixed on a large stone monument with 16 seated human figures carved around it and 36 blocks of hieroglyphs on its top.
Catherwood knew from seeing all the Egyptian hieroglyphs that he'd drawn over and over again along the Nile that this was a writing system. And that the writing system, they talked together about this, probably had something to do with the images on the front.
As Stevens and Catherwood's eyes examined the hieroglyphs, they were aware that all the great cultures of the past had developed their own writing systems. The people of Copan had clearly done the same, just like the civilizations of the old world.
There were no associations connected with the place. None of those stirring recollections which hallow Rome, Athens, and the world's great mistress on the Egypt plain. But architecture, sculpture, and painting, all the arts which embellish life, had flourished in this overgrown forest. Orators, warriors, and statesmen, beauty, ambition, and glory had lived and passed away.
But it begged the question, who had built this place, and what had become of them?
The city was desolate. It lay before us like a shattered bark amidst the ocean, her masts gone, her name effaced, her crew perished, and none to tell whence she came, to whom she belonged, how long at her voyage, or what caused her destruction. In the ruined cities of Egypt, even in the long-lost Petra, the stranger knows the story of the vestiges around it.
Stevens was convinced the answer to who had built this civilization had to lie in the hieroglyphs. One day, when someone could read them, they would be able to understand the history of those who had lived here.
In regards to the age of this desolate city, I shall not at present offer any conjecture. One thing I believe, that its history is graven on its monuments.
Stevens really believed that these were historical documents, that they weren't simply, say, astronomical observations, that they're the stories of real people's lives.
Spurred on by their amazing discovery at Copan, Stevens and Catherwood continued their trek across Central America in search of other ruins.
They know that somewhere out there there's this Palenque, and they've seen illustrations of that. So they were maybe already considering, well, maybe there's a very large area here. We don't know how it's constructed, whether it's an empire, whether these are kind of city-states. There was something definably similar across a wide area.
Over the next 2 years, they explored a vast region and traveled through Honduras, Guatemala, and the Yucatan in southeastern Mexico. Stevens and Catherwood uncovered, surveyed, and recorded another 43 ruined cities that had lain buried and forgotten for hundreds of years, including Uxmal, Palenque, Chichen Itza, and Tulum. And they found evidence of everything that people believed was needed for a civilization. Vast cities with central areas containing grand plazas, royal courts, and governors' palaces, proof of a sophisticated social hierarchy. Ornate temples, stepped pyramids, and monuments bearing hieroglyphic descriptions, proof of an organized religion. Gymnasiums and ball courts, astronomical observatories, intensive farming land, markets and trading centers, outlying villages, lookout towers and defensive walls with linking roads and causeways. All with a common architectural style that confirmed that there was once a single vast civilization here. Stevens and Catherwood returned to New York in the spring of 1842. They faced a new challenge. They had to convince the world that what they had discovered in Central America was truly groundbreaking. There really was a vast civilization that had once existed and thrived in a place where nobody believed there could be one. Stevens decided the best way to achieve this would be to publish a written, illustrated record of their expeditions. His first book, Incidents of Travel in Central America, came out in 1841 and was quickly followed by Incidents of Travel in Yucatan in 1843. Stevens' books contained over 200 Catherwood engravings and were an instant success, selling more than 20,000 copies within the first 3 months.
His volumes were really within the reach of the middle-class American reading public. And so the ruins reached a far wider audience than they ever had before.
Edgar Allan Poe called Stevens' work perhaps the most thrilling book on travel ever published. Catherwood then released his own volume, Views of Ancient Monuments in Central America, the following year. It documented their spectacular discoveries with 25 stunning hand-colored lithographs, which vividly brought the beautiful carved monuments, temples, and pyramids back to life.
What Catherwood did with his drawings was not so much just make pictures. He used the word draw in its larger sense of pulling. He pulled, basically drew an entire civilization out of the past into the present.
I think that there is a real parallel between Catherwood's painstaking illustration of every inch of a monument and Stevens doing the same thing in prose.
Together, the writings of Stevens and the illustrations of Catherwood would captivate the imagination of their readers.
Stephen had a fantastic rhetoric. His writing style was clear, descriptive, immersive, and he really portrayed a lot of his passion for what he was doing through his writing.
It was a perfect example of how the words and the images complemented one another. Neither one could have pulled this off on their own.
But for all their extraordinary revelations, there was still one question they could not answer. As Stevens wrote,
I now bid farewell to the ruins. I leave them with all mystery around them, and in the feeble hope that these imperfect pages may in some way throw a glimmer of light upon the great and long vainly mooted question: who were the peoplers of America?
Stevens and Catherwood would never know the answer. They both died early in their lives. Stevens from malaria at the age of 47, and Catherwood drowned when his ship sank crossing the Atlantic in 1854. He was 55. But eventually, Stevens' prediction would come true. When someone could read their hieroglyphic descriptions, they would understand who these people were. Over the next 170 years, the secrets of this culture's history were indeed proved to be in their writing.
Stevens is really the first Western explorer in Central America and Mexico, both to believe in indigenous authorship of the ruins and to glean the importance of the glyphs.
Archaeologists, inspired by Stevens and Catherwood's explorations, managed to read the writings and the images, and a picture emerged of the rise and fall of one of the world's greatest civilizations, the Maya. The earliest traces of their existence go back to 1500 BC, and possibly as far as 2500 BC. Their kingdoms stretched across a vast area of Central America, from southern Mexico to the Atlantic, and the Caribbean coast of Belize. Stevens and Catherwood's first discovery, Copan, was established in 450 AD and lasted for 400 years. With 20,000 people in an area of 100 square miles, it was the Athens of Central America from the 5th to the 9th centuries AD, at a time when Europe was lost in the Dark Ages. Copan, by any standards, was a highly developed and advanced civilization.
The Maya were a hugely sophisticated society and culture. They had a very complicated mathematics system. They were one of the few ancient groups to use the concept of zero, which is hugely important for mathematics. They had very detailed astronomy. They knew the movements of the planets and stars. They mapped the movement of Venus, for example, with a great amount of detail. Their calendar was very, very accurate, more accurate in many ways than Western calendars of a similar period. They managed to build these temples without the use of metal tools. They had very little metalwork, other than gold and silver for decorative purposes. They never had the wheel. They didn't have pack animals. There was no horses or carts or anything like that. But they were able to create temples as large, if not larger than those in Egypt.
Stevens and Catherwood's revelation that a mighty Maya civilization lay buried in the Central American jungle was one of the greatest discoveries of their age.
An artist and a lawyer go into a jungle. I mean, how more preposterous can it be? But the thing was, the very different personalities with that overlap produced this amazing scope, which would never have happened if they hadn't been that different.
Stevens and Catherwood proved that you didn't need to be a professional academic to be a great historian. What you needed was passion, an attention to detail, and an open mind.
I think, essentially in finally judging their achievement, you had these two people that complement each other wonderfully well, with this extraordinarily vivid text and the marvelous illustrations. And what you do have here, you have two people that have established the study of the Maya.
It was remarkable, not just an intellectual achievement. It was a feat of endurance. These were heroes. They produced a remarkable event under life-threatening circumstances. I think it was one of the great exploratory triumphs, absolutely, in history.
With their astonishing discoveries, the two amateur explorers overturned every prejudice we had about the development of cultures in the New World. Stevens and Catherwood had proved beyond doubt Native Americans had constructed a sophisticated civilization that compared to any of the finest ancient civilizations of the Old World. History tells that in the 16th century, the great Inca Empire fled from the ferocious onslaught of Spanish conquistadors. Somewhere deep inside the jungles of Peru, the Incas built a last stronghold. There, they made their final stand against their ruthless enemy. But with their death, the memory of where this last refuge was disappeared. But one man was determined to find it. An American explorer named Hiram Bingham.
He was Indiana Jones. He was 6'4", he looked like a Hollywood idol. He was a man obsessed with this mission.
Bingham was a tough explorer. No Andean mountain seems to have been too high for him, no jungle too dense.
And he did find an extraordinary Inca city. Machu Picchu. It was hailed as the lost city in the clouds. A spiritual Inca refuge, perching high on top of a skyscraping mountain. Bingham was convinced he had found the long-lost city of the Incas, their final refuge from the Spanish conquest. But all was not as it seemed. In 1911, there was a young scholar specializing in modern Latin American history at Yale University, USA, Hiram Bingham. But he was no impoverished academic. Bingham was 36 years old, married to Alfreda Mitchell, an heiress to the Tiffany Diamond Empire. They had 6 young sons and lived in a 30-roomed mansion on top of a hill. He was a man who seemed to have all the comforts of life. But Bingham was restless and driven.
Hiram Bingham had a really compulsive need to become famous, and I think that's because of his family.
He was Hiram Bingham III, and I think that's incredibly important because his grandfather, Hiram Bingham I, he was a very powerful, impressive missionary character, and so was his father, Hiram Bingham II. So there's this legacy, this weight on his shoulders that he had to prove himself or do something with his life at the very least.
What that something could be, he had absolutely no idea. To secure a permanent position at Yale University, Bingham went to Peru in 1909 to study the Spanish trade routes between Buenos Aires and Lima. During the journey, he was invited by his guide to see an ancient Inca site high up in the Andes Mountains. It was an event that would change his life.
It was my first introduction to prehistoric American history. I agreed, not knowing that it was going to lead me into a fascinating field.
Bingham is taken to this remote Inca ruin called Choqquequirao, which means cradle of gold, and is immediately struck by the romance of the position.
The Inca ruins lay 10,000 feet above sea level, and the climb was astounding, with breathtaking views of the distant snow-capped mountains and the roar of the Apurimac River below. It was also exhilarating.
At times, the trail was so steep that it was easier to go on all fours than to attempt to walk erect. Most of the time, we were hanging on to the side of the mountain almost by our eyelids.
On the way up, they saw amazing sights, including a huge condor that sailed down to take a look at them.
We could not only see his cruel beak and great talons, but even the whites of his eyes. It was an awe-inspiring moment.
Bingham was a tough explorer. No Andean mountain seems to have been too high for him, no jungle too dense.
Eventually, they reached the Inca ruins on the flattened peak. For Bingham, it was a magical experience. Choque Corral was built in the 15th century and was believed to be a sacred Inca dwelling and one of their frontier fortresses. It was designed to defend the approaches to their great capital city, Cusco. Bingham wrote to his wife Alfreda to tell her it was the most interesting place he had ever seen.
He's amazingly impressed by the remains of Inca architecture because he'd never known about this before. He'd heard of the Incas, but he didn't know that what they'd achieved was quite as impressive as this. Some people see this as sort of epiphany, you know, this really changes the direction of his life.
Till now, Bingham's knowledge of South American history was limited to the Spanish colonial days, and he knew very little about the Incas. As he looked out to the distant mountains, Bingham was keen to find out more about them. Who were these people who built this extraordinary place? What was their story?
Those snow-capped peaks in an unknown and unexplored part of Peru fascinated me greatly. They tempted me to go see what lay beyond.
And he thought of this line from Kipling.
Something hidden. Go and find it. Go and look behind the ranges.
You get this feeling that this worked on him, on his imagination, that somewhere just beyond the range was a city, a world, a reputation to be found.
Back in the Yale Library, Bingham began researching the Inca history. He opened the pages of the Spanish Chronicles, a key source on Spain's golden age of discovery, conquest, and colonization of the Americas.
He began reading more about the Incas. And of course, even as a non-academic, the story of the conquistadors and the Incas is incredibly exciting.
Bingham learned how from the early 13th century to the middle to late 16th century, the Incas were the most powerful empire in the Americas. Their domain stretched over 2,000 miles, from modern-day Chile to the Amazon. But then came catastrophe. In 1532, the Spanish conquistadors, headed by their ruthless leader, Francisco Pizarro, entered the Inca heartland. He was hell-bent on their destruction. Over the next 40 years, the Spaniards drove the Indians from their cities and slaughtered them in their thousands.
Bingham really is intrigued by the history of the last Incas and what they'd done after the Spaniards arrived.
Bingham's eyes were drawn to an account where a young Inca emperor named Manco had led his people as they fled their capital city, Cusco, in 1536. Manco managed to escape the Spanish and created a new Inca capital called Vitcos, 10,000 feet above sea level, somewhere in the remote mountainous region of the Vilcabamba Valley. But the Spanish conquistadors were in hot pursuit, and the Incas fled again. This time, the chronicles said, they went down from their mountain homes into the Amazon lowland. There, protected by a dense jungle in the largest rainforest in the world, they built a new city called Vilcabamba. And it was here that the Incas made their last stand. But it was all to no avail. In 1572, the Spaniards finally defeated the Incas. And so with their death, their last refuge, Vilcabamba, disappeared from history. Bingham was transfixed by the story of Vilcabamba. But for all the references of the city, there was one vital clue missing.
Nobody, as far as he could see, knew where it was. This appealed to Bingham as a puzzle he could solve himself.
Bingham tried to work out where Vilcabamba could be. The Spanish chronicles said it lay 30 miles and 2 long days' journey from Vitkos. But he had no idea even where Vitkos was. Continuing his studies, he found another clue. The chronicles said that Vitkos was 100 miles northwest of Cusco, along the Urubamba Valley in the Andes mountain range. Bingham knew where Cusco was. He had visited it on his last trip to South America. But if no one knew where Vitkos was, how would he know when he'd reached it? There was a further clue in the Spanish accounts. They said that there was a sacred area with a large white rock close by the city. So if Bingham could locate the white rock, he would know he had found Vitkos. Now Bingham realized that if he could find Vitkos, then 2 days beyond it, he should be able to find Vilcabamba. This, Bingham thought, would be how he could make his name. He would lead an expedition to find the Incas' last refuge, Vilcabamba. Bingham began to form his team.
He needed to be funded to take an expedition down there, particularly then. It was an expensive business.
The first thing Bingham did was approach a number of corporations. Businesses specializing in America's outdoor country pursuits offered their support. Abercrombie & Fitch supplied Bingham with an explorer's outfit.
He managed to get Winchester to give him a rifle, Kodak to give a camera, and then he turned to his classmates.
Bingham estimated that he would need 6 expedition members, and that each one would require $1,800 to cover their travel and food expenses. One former classmate heard about his plans and offered him $1,800 if he would take a Yale geologist with him. Bingham snapped up the offer. Others came forward. One was a topographer, another a mountain climbing engineer. Eventually, Bingham got together a multidisciplinary team.
So he's got a doctor, a naturalist, geologist, a couple of topographers. So it's a pretty good, well-rounded, versatile team.
To pay his own way, Bingham promised to write 4 articles for the fashionable Harper's magazine. But he was still $1,800 short. Only now did he turn to the one source he could rely on, his wife Alfreda, to tap the Tiffany fortune. She agreed. Bingham's party left New York for Peru on the 8th of June, 1911. Their destination? The former Inca capital city, Cusco. This, Bingham knew, lay near the Urubamba Valley in the Andes mountain range and would be his starting off point. Bingham's expedition arrived in Cusco on the 2nd of July, 1911. His aim was to first locate the sacred white rock at Vitkos, then to make his way down from the mountains into the lowland Amazon jungle to search for Vilcabamba. Bingham and his best friend, a naturalist named Harry Foote, set out on the morning of the 19th of July 1911 on their quest for where they believed Vilcabamba could be. The rest of the party were dispatched to carry out geological and mapping surveys of the Andes.
So they head off across the high-altitude lands, then descend into the Urubamba Valley itself. And the Urubamba is the famous sacred valley of the Incas, and follow the river along, sort of heading generally in the direction northwest.
Bingham kept a meticulous diary of his expedition. Today, it is regarded as one of the greatest first-hand accounts in the history of exploration.
I had entered the marvelous canyon of the Urubamba. Here the river runs through gigantic mountains of granite. I know of nowhere in the world that can compare with it.
Bingham writes in the most compulsive way. He's someone with academic authority, and yet he knows how to tell a good story.
Not only does it have great snow peaks looming above the clouds more than 2 miles overhead, it also has, in striking contrast, orchids and tree ferns, and the mysterious witchery of the jungle.
He paints pictures with words, and not just of visual things, but of the heart, you know, the spirit, what you're feeling.
One is drawn irresistibly onward by ever-recurring surprises, through a deep and winding gorge, turning and twisting past overhanging cliffs of incredible height.
He's still got a little way to go before he gets to this area where he thinks he's going to find Vitkos, the old Inca capital. So he's sort of working himself in, working the team in.
On the evening of the 23rd of July 1911, after a 70-mile journey from Cusco and 3/4 of the way to where Vitkos is said to be, Bingham and Foote set up camp for the night in a canyon surrounded by steep mountains.
They camp at a place called Mandor Pampa, and they meet a man there called Melchor Arteaga. And he questions him. He says, you know, are there ruins around here?
Arteaga told Bingham there were some fine ones on top of the opposite mountain called Huayna Picchu, and also on a ridge called Machu Picchu, or Old Peak.
People in Peru were always telling him that if he gave them a bit of money, they could lead him to a ruin. And there was a little bit of sort of won't get fooled again feeling in his team.
They had heard ruins were around many times, and they'd gone, it would be one little house or a couple of things.
And this is where I think we have to give a lot of credit to Bingham, because lesser men would have said, oh, for God's sake, you know, there's not supposed to be anything up that hill. There's nothing in the history books. This is just a wild goose chase.
Bingham noted the ruins' names in his pocket diary and arranged for Arteaga to take him there the following day. The morning of the 24th of July, 1911, dawned with a cold rain. Bingham prepared for his climb up Machu Picchu. His best friend Harry Foote didn't fancy the wet conditions.
The naturalist said there were more butterflies near the river. Anyway, it was my job to investigate. Arteaga shivered. He said it was too hard to climb for such a wet day. But when he found out that I was willing to pay him 3 or 4 times the ordinary daily wage, he finally agreed to go.
Arteaga and Bingham left the camp at 10 a.m.
After a walk of about 3/4 of an hour, Arteaga left the main road and plunged down through the bank of the river. Here there was a primitive bridge which crossed the roaring rapids. It was obvious that no one could live for an instant in the icy cold rapids, but would immediately be dashed to pieces against the rocks.
He said, I admit freely, I was on my hands and knees going really, really slowly across, and all I could think of was, I hope the water doesn't go up because it'll just take the bridge away.
After the river came the mountain.
Leaving the stream, we now struggled up the bank through dense jungle. And in a few minutes, reached the bottom of a very precipitous slope. For an hour and 20 minutes, we had a hard climb. A good part of the distance, we went on all fours, sometimes holding on by our fingernails.
Bingham was now climbing at nearly 8,000 feet.
Bingham was going up through very difficult cloud forest. Conditions were humid, it was hard work.
Shortly after noon, just as we were completely exhausted, we reached several good-natured Indians who were pleasantly surprised by our unexpected arrival. It seemed that these Indians had chosen this eagle's nest for their home.
A small boy named Pablo Richate was sent on to guide Bingham around the ruins.
He's led by this little boy around a corner, and he sees something quite extraordinary.
Hardly had we left and rounded the promontory, then we were confronted with an unexpected sight. A great flight of beautifully constructed stone-faced terraces, perhaps 100 of them, each hundreds of feet long and 10 feet high. They had recently been rescued from the jungle by the Indians.
It is an amazingly evocative description of firstly going through what were lovely Inca terraces, Bingham says, and then slowly things build.
From the cleared stonework, he was introduced to another spectacular sight.
Suddenly, without warning, under a huge overhanging ledge, the boy showed me a cave beautifully lined with the finest cut stone.
And then he's going from one wonder to another.
It had evidently been a royal mausoleum. On top of this particular ledge was a semicircular building whose outer wall, gently sloping and slightly curved, bore a striking resemblance to the famous Temple of the Sun in Cusco. Clearly, it was the work of a master artist.
Then there's the temple with the rounded wall, and then cumulatively, the overall effect.
Bingham was stunned by its magnificence and realized that this wasn't just some little Inca settlement he has come to see.
It seemed like an unbelievable dream. Dimly, I began to realize that this wall and its adjoining semicircular temple over the cave were as fine as the finest stonework in the world. It fairly took my breath away. What could this place be? Why had no one given us any idea of it? Surprise followed surprise in bewildering succession. Suddenly we found ourselves standing in front of the ruins of two of the finest and most interesting structures in ancient America.
There are cyclopean stones, as he calls them. Stones the height of a human, but beautifully worked with very, very fine granite.
On the east side of the plaza was another amazing structure, the ruins of a temple containing 3 great windows looking out over the canyon to the rising sun. Like its neighbor, it is unique among Inca ruins.
Bingham had made an extraordinary discovery. It seemed almost too good to be true.
Would anyone believe what I had found? Fortunately, in this land where accuracy in reporting what one has seen is not a prevailing characteristic of travelers, I had a good camera, and the sun was shining.
I know that he had a very special Kodak camera that was made for traveling in rugged territory, and the negatives are huge. So the resolution, you know, the detail is really fantastic.
But one question puzzled Bingham. Where was he?
Now, Bingham was not really looking for a ruin in this part of the world, so he couldn't make sense of what he'd found.
Machu Picchu laid 70 miles from Cusco, so it couldn't be Vitkos, which was said to be 100 miles from Cusco. And it couldn't be the Incas' last refuge, Vilcabamba, because that was said to be 30 miles on from Vitkos, down on the jungle plains. So what was this astonishing place? Suddenly, Bingham's eye focused on some charcoaled graffiti on a rock of the 3-windowed temple. Lizarraga, 1902. His blood ran cold.
Bingham was a man who wanted to make a name for himself, and he was pulled up short. He suddenly saw this graffiti. Had some scholar got there first?
Bingham wrote the name Lizarraga 1902 in his diary and prayed it wasn't another explorer.
Maybe he'd been picked to the post. Maybe this wasn't really a discovery at all.
Deeply worried, Bingham made his way back down the mountain. He hardly mentioned the Machu Picchu ruins when he returned to the campsite below. In fact, his best friend, Harry Foote, wrote in his diary, no special things to note. Bingham discreetly asked Arteaga about the Lizarraga 1902 graffiti. Arteaga told Bingham, Augustin Lizarraga is the discoverer of Machu Picchu. He lives at San Miguel Bridge, just downstream of your campsite.
And at that point, Hiram Bingham must have sighed and thought, oh, that is that. And he actually writes it in his diary. Lizarraga is the discoverer. And his heart must have sunk.
Bingham was horrified and set off to find the mysterious Lizarraga. But when he got to San Miguel Bridge, Augustin Lizarraga was not at home. So Bingham spoke to his brother, Angel. Angel told him that the ruins were known in the valley and parts of it were cultivated by farmers. His brother was one of those farmers. Bingham relaxed. Lizarraga wasn't a rival academic after all. He was just a local Peruvian peasant. Bingham's discovery of Machu Picchu was secure. The very next day, he set off on another long journey to search for the last refuge of the Incas, Vilcabamba. But first, he had to locate the White Rock at Vitcos. Bingham followed the information detailed in the Spanish chronicles he had read back at Yale. He asked every local they passed if they knew the whereabouts of any ruins in the area, and paid local guides to lead him onwards.
He carries on down the valley into even more uncharted territory. He's put the whole thing of Machu Picchu to one side.
"15 days after encountering the ruins of Machu Picchu, Bingham came across the sacred White Rock, mentioned in the chronicles as being close to the Incas' capital city, Vitcos.
It was late on the afternoon of August 9th, 1911, when I first saw this remarkable shrine. We could now be fairly sure that we had located one of Manco's capitals, Vitcos.
If Bingham had found the ruins of the former Inca city, Vitcos, it meant that he had to be on the right track and close to completing his objective, finding their last refuge, Vilcabamba. The Chronicles said it was a long 2-day journey from Vitcos.
By now, Bingham's blood is up. I mean, he realized that these ruins are toppling over like 9 pins. You know, he's found Machu Picchu, he's found Vitcos, and there's one final place he wants to find, which is a place where the Inca emperor and the exiles escaped to if the Spanish ever came looking for them.
Bingham came down from the mountains into the huge lowland jungles of the Amazon. This was now a very different world to the ethereal mountaintops of Machu Picchu. It was a place that even the local Peruvians feared, like the Spanish conquistadors before them.
One of our informants said the Inca city was called Espiritu Pampa, or the Plain of the Ghosts, to be reached only by a hard trail passable for barefooted savages, but scarcely available for us unless we chose to go on our hands and knees.
Finally, after several days traveling, Bingham found, beneath the thick twines of a rainforest jungle, evidence of some ruins. To his excitement, the locals called it Espiritu Pampa. Even better, they also called it Vilcabamba. Surely, Bingham had found the last refuge of the Incas. But as he set to work, he came across something very puzzling. The few buildings he had found were clearly Inca, but their stonework was rough and inferior. Bingham searched for more extensive ruins, but failed to find anything substantial. Bingham wrote in his diary,
After several days digging, ruins well scattered, long hard job to clear ruins, hardly worthwhile.
The more Bingham dug, the more he became convinced that the site just wasn't special enough to be Vilcabamba. But if this wasn't the place where the Incas had their last refuge, then where was it? Slowly, Bingham started to reconsider the evidence. He went back to the Spanish chronicles. They told him that Vilcabamba was the largest city in the province. Machu Picchu was clearly much bigger than anything he had found in the jungle. Then there was the puzzling issue of the inferior architecture. Nothing he saw in the Amazon matched the finely cut stone at Machu Picchu. Bingham also wondered about something else. Would the Incas, who are highland people, have really made a home down in the flatland jungle?
It does not seem reasonable that such people would have cared to live in the hot valley of Espiritu Pampa. These Inca ruins are unique in lying so low in the Amazon jungle. The difference in climate is as great as that between Scotland and Egypt. Furthermore, they could have found the seclusion and safety which they craved just as well in several other parts of the province, particularly at Machu Picchu.
Now he began focusing on another issue. The chronicles stated that the city of Vilcabamba lay 2 days' march from Vitkos. So did Machu Picchu, albeit in a different direction.
Machu Picchu was roughly 2 days from Vitkos if you walked across, and he did it. He walked from Vitkos across back to Machu Picchu directly.
An idea slowly began to dawn on him. Could his discovery, Machu Picchu, be the real Vilcabamba? Bingham returned to America at the end of 1911, determined to prove his case.
After Bingham discovered Machu Picchu in 1911, there was very little publicity. Tiny mentions in the New York Times and the Geographical magazine in London, but nothing much.
Bingham revisited Machu Picchu in 1912, increasingly convinced it was Vilcabamba, the last refuge of the Incas. He was now head of a major excavation and clearing program, funded by Yale and the National Geographic Society. Looking over the tangled city, Bingham wrote in his diary,
Machu Picchu ruins as fine as ever. Very impressive.
the material Bingham produced was so impressive that the National Geographic devoted an entire issue of their magazine to his discovery.
The owner of National Geographic magazine said, we're going to make Machu Picchu a star, and moreover, Mr. Bingham, we're going to make you a star as well.
In April 1913, with the cover title, In the Wonderland of Peru, National Geographic published in pictures and text Bingham's amazing account of his finding of Machu Picchu. The news was a global sensation. The public needed little convincing. Finally, it became accepted that Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba, the Inca's final refuge. And Hiram Bingham's name was made. Hiram Bingham would go down in history as one of the all-time great explorers. But there is an irony in this tale. Machu Picchu was an amazing Inca site. However, modern scholars now believe that the ruins at Espiritu Pampa, which Bingham had dismissed in 1911, are far grander and larger than he had realized.
In 1964, some 50 years after Bingham had been there, an American called Gene Savoy, an adventurer and archaeologist, went down to Espiritu Pampa and did a much more thorough clearing of the site and established really beyond doubt that that was indeed the proper last refuge of the Incas, which I think all archaeologists would agree today.
Bingham's initial detective work that had led him to Espiritu Pampa had been on the right trail after all. He had found the real Vilcabamba. He just hadn't realized it. So if Machu Picchu wasn't the last refuge of the Incas, what was it? Today, Machu Picchu is believed to have been built by the Incas during the expansion of their empire in the mid-15th century, 75 years before the Spanish arrived. It was constructed as a royal estate and served as a sacred and seasonal retreat for the Inca rulers whenever the weather was severe in their capital city, Cusco.
Everyone now tends to the view that it was built as a winter palace for an Inca emperor, probably the greatest of them all, Pachacuti. He could come down with his retinue to Machu Picchu, which has a much better climate, and enjoy a fabulous resort-type atmosphere. It was a very exclusive place, which is perhaps why there was no historical record of it. It was a place where an emperor could build his own fantasy creation in the clouds, a sort of Las Vegas, if you like, which, if it didn't have neon billboards, did have this show-off architecture that only an emperor could afford.
Scholars now believe Machu Picchu was abandoned by the Incas long before the Spanish arrived in Peru in 1532. Why they left their great winter retreat, however, remains a mystery. So where does that leave Hiram Bingham today? Was he just an adventurer who allowed his prejudice and emotions to get the better of him? Most would regard that as too harsh. To many explorers, he remains a hero.
Hiram Bingham was the perfect man of the moment. Here was a character with a dream, someone who wished to find treasure, and that is exactly what he did.
He made the discovery both of Machu Picchu and of other very important Inca sites. I think in many ways he is a bit of a hero, and rather more of a hero perhaps than Indiana Jones, because he's real.
He was the first scientific discoverer, the man who took the time, brought money to the enterprise, who exposed Machu Picchu to the world, literally peeling back that forest and showing us what an extraordinary place it was.
I was so happy that he had had the energy and the curiosity and the drive to find Machu Picchu, to rediscover it, to write about it, to make it famous to the whole world so other people could come and really enjoy it.
Despite being wrong about Vilcabamba and Machu Picchu, Hiram Bingham is still regarded as one of the greatest explorers of his age. After all, perhaps, he found one of the great wonders of the modern world.
The sanctuary was lost for centuries because this ridge is in the most inaccessible corner of the most inaccessible section of the Central Andes. No part of the highlands of Peru is better defended by natural bulwarks. A stupendous canyon whose rock is granite and whose precipices are frequently 1,000 feet sheer. Yet here, in a remote part of the canyon, on a narrow ridge flanked by tremendous precipices, a highly civilized people, artistic, inventive, well-organized, and capable of sustained endeavor at some time in the distant past, built themselves a sanctuary for the worship of the sun.
Legend tells that somewhere in South America, there is a great city of gold, El Dorado. A fabulously rich and sophisticated kingdom that was once home to thousands of people living deep in the heart of the Amazon jungle.
This was a stone city with squares and grand plazas and wonderful buildings with columns and carvings and statues.
To most people, it was just a legend. But for British explorer, 57-year-old Percy Fawcett, it was real.
It wasn't that far-fetched to imagine that somewhere deep in Amazonia, there was a major civilization.
Convinced he knew the location of this lost world, he spent years searching for it.
He was someone prepared to put his life on the line, head off into the middle of nowhere and do whatever it took to achieve his goal.
With his son Jack and his best friend Raleigh, Fawcett set out in 1925 to find it.
They were convinced that this was going to be a great success and that they were all going to be really rich.
30 days into their journey, Fawcett wrote to his wife, "You have no fear of any failure." Then all three vanished. This is the story behind Percy Fawcett's dream. And it seems that he may have been onto something. There really may have been a great civilization in the jungle, but its riches were not gold. The true secret of the real El Dorado was something with the amazing power to completely transform all our lives. In the spring of 1906, Percy Fawcett was summoned to a meeting at the Royal Geographical Society in London and was made an offer he couldn't refuse.
Fawcett, have a look at this.
The Bolivian government wanted someone to map its borders with Brazil, and 39-year-old Fawcett was perfect for the job. His family motto was "Difficulties be damned." All his life he excelled at everything he had ever done. He was a first-class cricketer, an officer in the Royal Artillery, and a former British Secret Service spy in Morocco. But critically, he was a highly trained mapmaker and geographical surveyor who had been taught how to fix his position anywhere in the world. Fawcett's mission would be to survey and map the western Bolivian borders with Peru and Brazil. And his exploration, he was told, would be difficult and dangerous. But to Fawcett, all this sounded like a dream job. The romantic history of the Spanish and Portuguese conquests of South America and the mystery of its jungles pulled him in. Now his heart was pounding, even though there were complications.
There were my wife and son to consider, and another child on the way. But destiny intended me to go, so there could be no other answer.
Fawcett's destiny had been sealed from a very early age.
I think he was about 6 or 7, and the family was living on the Devon coast. He discovered some Roman remains in a cave near where they were living, and they excited him enormously. It made him the center of attention, and it caught his imagination. And I think that it was that single incident that put the spark there. And for the rest of his life, he was searching for treasure.
It was this thirst for adventure that made the Amazon job so irresistible.
There is something about the Amazon, it's the greatest of all rainforests. It's something like 3,500 miles across. And I think it's that mystery that somehow got to Fawcett, drew him out there and away from all he'd loved into a place of danger.
From 1906 to 1911, Fawcett made several difficult surveying expeditions into the Amazon jungle.
Fawcett was a person who had really extraordinary field skills, and it's important to realize that the kinds of work that he did do was not easy at all.
Not only did Fawcett have to deal with the hostile environment,
Disease fevers of one kind or another were everywhere. People were going down within days of starting work in these areas.
but to make it worse, Fawcett was surveying in an area crawling with dangerous locals.
He was in one of the most contentious parts of the Amazon, in one of the most inflammatory periods in Amazonian history.
There were very hostile tribes in the very areas he was going through. There were roaming gangs, people who threatened your lives, people who were killing people. All of this would, to many people, have made the assignment sound terrible, but of course, to Fawcett, it was just like throwing coal on the fire. He loved it.
But as the years passed by, something else was beckoning him. Fawcett was becoming hooked on exploring the Amazon jungle.
Deep down inside of me, a tiny voice was calling. At first, scarcely audible, it persisted until I could no longer ignore it. Inexplicably, amazingly, I knew I loved that hell. Its fiendish grasp had captured me.
Fawcett realized that the surveying work was holding him back, and by 1911 he had had enough and resigned.
Fawcett once said that he much preferred the company of savages to civilized boors. I think that says a lot about the man, that he was someone who was a maverick, who was an outsider, who wanted freedom, who sort of embraced the wilds somehow.
Fawcett's heart was in exploration, but what he needed now was a mission grand enough to satisfy his passion.
When he first went out and was surveying, he heard stories of an advanced civilization in Brazil.
He was on to the gossip, these stories that twirled around and swirled around these areas.
He didn't reject them, he rather accepted them. And it was those stories that led him piecing them together like a jigsaw puzzle.
I had by this time heard in several places vague traditions about the remains of the ancient civilizations, and my imagination was stirred by them to such an extent that the urge to investigate was becoming more and more insistent.
We knew that there were incredible civilizations in the highlands and in Mexico, so why would there not be, in the heart of Amazonia, some extraordinary civilization that people just hadn't gotten around to finding?
Then in the same year Fawcett stopped surveying, the ancient Inca ruins of Machu Picchu were discovered in the Peruvian Andes by the US. It was the most important find in South America since the days of the Spanish conquest. This really fired Fawcett's belief. He became certain that there had to be something even more fabulous out there.
Machu Picchu's romantic discovery was recent news, but my objective dated much earlier than the Incas, and I felt it was to be sought farther east, in the wilds still unknown. All the great Indian tribes had traditions of a once great civilization to the east.
He was in an area which was at the confluence not just of the Inca civilizations, but also the confluence of Bolivian civilizations and these upper Amazonian civilizations. And those areas were talked about with a great deal of interest in the early exploration in the 1500s.
One story that obsessed Fawcett was the historical account of the Spanish conquistadors' Amazon expedition in 1541.
Fawcett was very familiar with the literature of the Amazon, and he must have been hugely struck by the earliest accounts from the 16th century. People like Francisco de Orellana, who was the man who first descended the Amazon and discovered it for Europe.
For 8 months, Orellana and his 57 conquistadors traveled downriver towards the sea searching for El Dorado, a kingdom of gold described by various Indian tribes as being a city deep inside the jungle.
And eventually, as they went down, they met large groups of people in villages. They went as far as finding roads heading to the interior. They heard that there were towns in the interior.
Orellana tells us that there were highly populated riverbanks, and we're talking about communities perhaps of 20,000 strong. So this must have played on Fawcett's mind.
They recorded a different set of groups and different groups of people. Some were dressed, some were not. And they noted that they were in very large quantities.
Could this be what Fawcett was looking for? If so, where was this city? Fawcett then came across another intriguing record housed in Rio's National Archives Library in Brazil.
One of the documents that we know particularly fascinated Fawcett was document 512.
This decaying historical account was known simply by the catalogue number 512 because it had no author. The name of the person who discovered the city had worn away, so Fawcett called him Francisco Raposo. Raposo was a Portuguese soldier of fortune who described how, after a long, troublesome journey incited by the insatiable greed of gold, he and his men came across a mountain path that had been cut by man rather than by nature. And when they reached the top, they saw a spellbinding vista, a huge deserted city. The man Fawcett dubbed Raposo had written,
"We went on into the strange city, and we came on a road of great length and a well-set-out plaza, and in the middle of the plaza, a column of black stone of extraordinary grandeur. We went with fear and trembling into some of the houses, and in none did we find vestiges of furniture or movable objects by which or whose use we might guess at the sort of people who had dwelt therein.
The city was deserted, but within it they found all manner of fantastic things, these large halls and columned buildings and broad boulevards, just like something you might find in ancient Greece, or imagine you'd find in ancient Greece, sitting there right in the middle of the jungle at a fork in the river.
We marveled that this place had been abandoned by those who had formerly inhabited it, for with all our careful investigations and great diligence, we had met no person in this wilderness who might tell us of this deplorable marvel of an abandoned city whose ruins, statues, and grandeur attested its former populousness, wealth, and its flourishing in the centuries past."
Fawcett was fascinated. Raposo had come across this vast, lost city.
I've looked at it myself, and it conjures up images of a lost world, a sort of city of gold.
Although there was no mention in the document of the city's location, Fawcett now had further evidence of the existence of an ancient civilization deep inside the Amazon jungle. And he was also convinced that this was the same city that Oriana had seen 200 years earlier.
It was exactly what he was looking for. It was proof positive. This wasn't his imagination. This wasn't something he'd made up or that was just the myth story of native peoples. Here we had it in black and white.
Had Oriana and Raposo seen the lost city of El Dorado? Fawcett himself would never call it El Dorado. "I call it Zed for the sake of convenience," he wrote. Even though Fawcett had never seen this lost city, he was happy to describe what it would look like to his younger son, Brian.
The central place I call Zed, our main objective, is in a valley surmounted by lofty mountains. The valley is about 10 miles wide, and the city is on an eminence in the middle of it, approached by a barreled roadway of stone. I expect the ruins to be monolithic in character, more ancient than the oldest Egyptian discoveries. Judging by inscriptions found in many parts of Brazil, the inhabitants used an alphabetical writing allied to many ancient European and Asian scripts.
We don't really know an exact moment when Zed came into his mind. He had always believed that there were certain places in the world that were home to advanced civilizations.
Fawcett was also convinced of something else. He believed that the people who lived in these remote, hidden places possessed extraordinary abilities. In this, he had been influenced by his peculiar upbringing.
Fawcett had a very unusual background as an explorer. He wasn't someone whose father was someone who wanted to get to the South Pole or North Pole. Nothing obvious about him at all. Rather the opposite. He was from a strange background, you could say.
His aristocratic father spent the family's wealth and died of drink at the age of 45. And so it was to his mother the young Percy turned for inspiration.
His mother was very interested in spiritualism and had a very great influence on Fawcett, and it lasted all his life.
Fawcett's wife, Nina, was also interested in seances and astrology, and his elder brother, Edward, was a member of the Theosophy movement, a philosophical school formed by Helena Petrova Blavatsky to obtain hidden wisdom and enlightenment.
He was influenced particularly in the religious area. Among other things, Percy at one point went out to India to be with Helena Blavatsky.
Blavatsky's many followers included Gandhi, Thomas Edison, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. All this greatly inspired Fawcett's beliefs, especially Blavatsky's conviction that there were master priests capable of producing psychic messages to save mankind, and they lived in remote cities in such places as Tibet and South America. By September 1914, Fawcett was getting closer to locating his lost city of Zed, in his mind, a vast spiritual civilization. But before he could go, the First World War broke out. Fawcett found himself in the thick of it on the Western Front.
He fought some of the major battles and was very active, was mentioned in dispatches, was promoted in the field to colonel. I think that for several days he was actually a general.
By the end of the war, Fawcett had received 2 medals, the Distinguished Service Medal for Bravery and a gold medal from the Royal Geographical Society for his historic mapping of South America. But his obsession hadn't left him. On his return to England, Fawcett was more determined than ever to make his path to Zed, as he called it, a reality. Fawcett told his young son, Brian,
"The answer to the enigma of ancient South America, and perhaps of the prehistoric world, may be found when those old cities are located and opened up to scientific research. That the cities exist, I know."
Gradually, piece by piece, clue by clue, Fawcett zeroed in on where Zed had to be. Influences from his past, especially his mother and Helena Blavatsky. Conversations with tribal peoples. Archival records from Francisco de Orellana's 1541 expedition of seeing communities 20,000 strong. And Raposo's account of a spellbinding vista of a huge deserted city eventually pointed Fawcett to just one place. His lost city of Zed lay alongside the Xingu River in an area of southwestern Brazil called the Mato Grosso. All he needed was the money to get there. But Fawcett was facing severe setbacks. Britain was exhausted after the war and experiencing a severe economic collapse.
To return again would take every penny I could find. I came out of the war convinced that as a world power, Britain was on the wane. Many thousands must have come through those 4 years of mud and blood with the same disillusionment.
Raising money for another Amazon expedition proved almost impossible.
His hopes were dashed very quickly. He had hoped that the Royal Geographical Society would provide the funds. He found that there wasn't money to come.
Money wasn't the only thing Fawcett had to contend with. Fawcett's professional colleagues began to question the importance and validity of his quest for a lost city called Zed.
People were beginning to say, just a minute, you know. Some of these stories this fellow are telling are nonsense. This can't be right. It doesn't make sense. Do we really want to finance this stuff?
Many felt that the lost city of Zed could not exist for environmental reasons. They argued that the soil of the Amazon was simply not productive enough to support a large society. Seething with frustration, Fawcett wrote,
I cannot induce scientific men to accept the supposition that there are traces of an old civilization in the Amazon.
But eventually help did come. Although the Royal Geographical Society couldn't pay for Fawcett's next expedition, they did support his application with the Brazilian government to secure some money. In 1920, Fawcett was back in the Amazon, searching for his El Dorado, the lost city of Zed, with 2 male companions. But the expedition didn't go smoothly. Rains flooded their route and destroyed their equipment. Four weeks into their journey, their animals started to die. A starving dog had to be shot, and Fawcett killed one of their horses to put it out of its misery. The place became known as Dead Horse Camp. Then one of Fawcett's companions suffered a mental breakdown, and the other ran off to Rio to get married. Undeterred, Fawcett carried on alone.
He really was obsessed with finding this city. People were falling sick all around him, but somehow it didn't seem to affect him. He could go on and on and on.
All the explorers are driven people. You've got to be driven. You've got to be someone who is able to hang on to your vision, whatever you come across. And yet, this is a man apart. He really was a fanatic.
Always driven by the hope of finding Zed, the hope that it was over the next hill, that there would be a new scrap of information that would lead him there.
Loneliness is not intolerable when enthusiasm for a quest fills the mind. The chief disadvantage seemed to be that were I to find anything of scientific or archaeological value, there would be no witnesses to support my word.
Soon, finding Zed became the least of Fawcett's worries.
The rainforest looks incredibly abundant. It looks like the perfect place to survive in. But the soils are thin. A lot of that food is right up in the tree canopy. Up there, the monkeys. Your greatest danger is starvation.
Starvation sounds almost unbelievable in forest country, and yet it is only too likely to happen.
And after 3 months alone in the jungle, exhausted, without food, and close to death, Fawcett abandoned his expedition. Back home in Devon, he would spend the next 2 years kicking his heels with frustration.
The last few years have been the most wretched and disillusioning of my life, full of anxieties. My wife and children have been sacrificed for it.
I think that his wife and children missed him enormously. Nina particularly was very sad and lonely with his long, long absences, and the children doted on him.
Of our 24 years of married life, only 10 have been spent together. Apart from 4 years in the Great War, I have spent 10 in the forest.
You have to feel for his wife, poor old Nina. Whenever he was back in Devon, he felt he wanted to exchange that love and that comfort that she could provide for the danger, for the mystery of the Amazon.
Who will ever understand that I want no glory from it, no money for myself, that I am doing it unpaid in the hope that its ultimate benefit to mankind will justify the years spent in the quest?
In desperation, Fawcett went to New York to find backers for his next expedition.
These kinds of expeditions were quite costly. So he had to be able to self-promote and to make this seem as the most important imaginable expedition out there at the time so that he could attract the funds, attract the attention.
And Fawcett did attract some attention. His promotional speeches convinced scientific institutions like the Museum of the American Indian and the American Geographical Society to support his journey with $1,000 each. But it wasn't nearly enough.
He gave a series of lectures, he went around to see big business. Fawcett was not a man to bring doubt into his conversation. He spoke very forcefully.
But he still couldn't raise the money and was forced to come up with a new plan.
Fawcett was quite a bit of a self-promoter. He constructed things as what we might call a kind of reality show in which he would then be able to catapult himself into an icon of exploration.
Fawcett approached the National American Newspaper Alliance, whose members had a paper in almost every city in the country, with a novel idea. He would send runners back out of the jungle with minute-by-minute dispatches of their quest to find the lost city of Zed, so his readers would be able to follow and experience their journey as it happened. Captivated by his idea, the newspapers gave Fawcett a very lucrative deal. Similar deals were made with newspapers around the world, ensuring millions of readers. But most of the money would only be paid to Fawcett on the completion of their journey.
In some ways, I am rather glad that not one of the three of us makes a red cent unless the journey is successful, for nobody can say we were after the money in undertaking this rather perilous quest.
In 1924, Fawcett was back in Britain. As news of the planned expedition grew in excitement and support, the Royal Geographical Society agreed to pay for their equipment. Eventually, Fawcett managed to raise around $5,000, the very bare minimum, Fawcett believed, to get them through to Zed.
I found enough to make it imperative to go again. With the right companions, the right organization, and knowledge of the right way to go in, it can be brought to a successful conclusion. And our story, when we return from the next expedition, may thrill the world.
But Fawcett was reluctant to give too much away to the press before they left.
I cannot say all I know, or even be precise as to the locality, for these things leak out, and there can be nothing so bitter to the pioneer as to find the crown of his work anticipated.
A traveller is someone who wanders along, perhaps just for the sheer hell of it, but an explorer has a dream, has a vision, and is determined not just to pull off that vision, but to bring back information, bring back evidence of whatever it is he or she has found.
After his disastrous last expedition, Fawcett carefully picked his travel companions this time. His son Jack, now 21, and as strong as a horse and as keen as mustard, wanted to go with him. With Jack was his lifelong friend, Raleigh Rimmel.
Fawcett knew what he was up against. He was hardened. He'd seen firsthand the forest. He'd lived there. But that wasn't the case for his two companions. Raleigh Rimmel in his 20s, his son Jack, again in his 20s, totally fresh, totally naive.
Fawcett warned them both of the risks.
It would be one of the most difficult and dangerous expeditions in the history of exploration, the ultimate test of faith, courage, and determination.
So here was a man who understood the importance of precision, and yet here also was a mystic, a man who was prepared to set off with two inexperienced companions into the blue, into a mapless state and wander around somehow until he found his lost city.
He told his wife, he said, look, we're going to be away a long time. It could be a year. Don't be frightened. Don't expect to hear from us. We're going to go forward. We're going to find Zed. We're going to have this enormous success.
In January 1925, Fawcett, Jack and Raleigh sailed from New York to Brazil, watched by the world's press.
It was a world-renowned expedition, and it was being followed very closely. By this time, they had been interviewed by all of the major newspapers. People were really excited that they were going off to find a lost civilization, and they believed they were going to do it. And so there was indeed a huge send-off. He was a major celebrity. Front page news.
The following month, they left Rio de Janeiro on their 1,000-mile journey by train and boat into the interior of Brazil. Their destination? The Mato Grosso's capital, Cuiabá. Fawcett called it their stepping-off point. On April the 20th, 1925, Fawcett, Jack and Raleigh put on their explorers' outfits and Stetson hats, grabbed their .30 caliber rifles and 18-inch machetes, and left for the jungle. Opinion was divided as to whether their expedition was sheer lunacy or not.
It's a little bit like Fitzcarraldo, where everyone thinks, oh, what a nut, getting a ship over a mountain and putting it on another tributary. But people were doing that all the time. So even though we might think it's the sign of total madness, in fact, at the time, it was a reasonable conjecture and a bold thing to try.
Their direction was towards the Mato Grosso's upper Xingu River system, a tributary of the Amazon where Fawcett believed the city of Zed would be.
The Mato Grosso is thick forest. Mato Grosso, that's what it means. And it is a devil of a place. That's the sort of phrase he would have used. A thick, nasty place. We're used to seeing a horizon. We're used to heading towards something. But in the forest, you see tree after tree after tree, and no more so than in the Mato Grosso.
Sticking to the deal made with the press, Fawcett used runners to keep the public informed of their progress.
As they went on each step of the journey, Fawcett would write a report of what they had seen, what they had experienced, and this chap would run back to Civilization with it. They appeared in the American press, in the British press, in the Australian press, in quite a number of continental European papers.
Jack told his mother of meeting stark naked Indians, of never feeling so well on his 22nd birthday, and that it would take a couple of months to reach Zed, possibly on his daddy's 58th birthday. In fact, things were now becoming difficult for the explorers. In Fawcett's private letters to Nina, another story emerged. Along with descriptions of the difficulties of traveling, he revealed how Raleigh's foot had been poisoned by the insects.
I suspect constitutional weakness, and I fear that we shall be handicapped by him,
he wrote.
There was Raleigh's foot. It was painful. It was slowing them down.
Fawcett warned him that there would be no way out if it got any worse, but Raleigh refused to go back.
Raleigh felt that he'd come all this way. They were so close to the great treasure. He wasn't going to drop out at this stage, no matter what.
They were also approaching an area where there were tribes known to be aggressive.
It was Fawcett's hope that he would be able, as he had in the past, to make friends quickly, to gain their confidence, and in fact, more than their confidence, to gain their generosity because they needed their food.
It is obviously dangerous to penetrate large hordes of Indians traditionally hostile, but I believe in our mission and its purpose. I believe our little party of 3 white men will make friends with them all.
On the 29th of May 1925, 39 days into their journey, they reached Dead Horse Camp, where Fawcett had passed through on his last expedition.
Fawcett sat alone. We know this because Jack also wrote and said that his father had sat alone and wrote to his beloved Nina back in Devon.
The attempt to write is fraught with much difficulty. Here we are at Dead Horse Camp, the spot where my horse died in 1920. Only his white bones remain. Jack is well and fit. Raleigh I am anxious about. He still has one leg in a bandage, but won't go back. So far we have plenty of food, but I am not sure how long this will last. It is very cold at night and fresh in the morning, but the insects and heat are out in full force come midday, and from then until evening, it is sheer misery in camp. I cannot hope to stand up on this journey better than Jack or Raleigh. My extra years tell, though I do my best to make up for it with enthusiasm. But I had to do this.
Despite all this, Fawcett remained upbeat and ended his letter with,
"You need have no fear of any failure."
The next day, Fawcett gave the guide Nina's letter and waved him goodbye. These were the last words to his wife. With just Jack and Raleigh as company, he headed out into uncharted territory. All over the world, people waited for news, wondering where they were. But there was nothing but silence.
And the tensions on the home front, of course, were just awful. Nina had this great faith in him. She did believe that all was well.
Even 2 years after Fawcett had vanished, Nina believed he was coming back.
Any day now may bring a cable from my husband announcing that he is safe and is returning with Jack and Raleigh.
To read her correspondence is heartbreaking. 10 years after he disappeared, she still believed that he would turn up any day, that he was still alive, probably at that point that he was living in Zed.
But the news she longed for never came. And despite the many search parties sent out to try and find them over the years, their bodies have never been found. "25 years later, in 1955, the New York Times declared that Fawcett's disappearance had set off more searches than those launched through the centuries to find the fabulous El Dorado. Were they killed by Indians, as most believe, or did they die of hunger, or was it something else?
I don't think he was killed by hostile Indians. I don't think he was bitten by a snake. I don't think he was swept away by floodwater. I don't think he's still living out there and immortal in some Shangri-La, some city of gold. I think one or other of them stumbled, fell, couldn't keep on going any longer because of disease. And then the others had a choice. Do we stay with this dying man, our companion, or do we head off and go for help? Well, there's no help. available out there, and I'm afraid they probably all died together.
But no one really knows. They had vanished without trace. Did Percy Fawcett and his companions die in vain? Were all those doubters right? There was no great civilization in the jungle called El Dorado. Had he simply been deluded? In recent years, scientists have made a series of extraordinary discoveries. In the same area where Francisco de Orellana and his 57 conquistadors saw cities of 20,000 people in 1541, and just 100 miles west of Fawcett's last search for Zed, compelling evidence of past civilizations is now being unearthed.
He basically traversed one of the areas in which some of the most exciting discoveries in the Amazon basin are taking place.
Hidden in the jungle for several hundred years and only emerging now as trees are felled to create farmland is evidence of a vast network of ancient sites. These sites, seen from the air, show an extraordinary crisscrossed landscape with straight lines cutting across the savanna. Amongst the open plains, there are also thousands of isolated mounds or islands of rich forest linked by giant causeways. Recently, it was discovered in these forest islands there are clear signs of past human habitation. Fragments of food remains, pottery, cooking urns and human bones are now being uncovered on a massive scale. Here was evidence of a huge civilization. Archaeologists believe these sites and forest areas are part of an ancient civilization state that stretches over 160 square miles and was once home to hundreds of thousands of people.
It's important to remember that these cities were as large as Constantinople in the 1500s, or as large as London, which was one of the largest cities of the time. These great civilizations were complex. We know that they had complex religions, they had complex technologies, they were the great engineering societies of the time.
Could these be the remains of the great cities Francisco de Orellana and Raposo had described all those years ago? The ones that inspired Fawcett's quest to find his lost city of Zed? If so, why had they been swallowed up by the jungle? The answer is almost certain, that the people met the fate of all the other Indians who were killed by disease brought in by European explorers. With contact from the Spanish in the 16th century, swiftly over 95% of their population was wiped out, and their homes and cities disappeared with them. But how did these great civilizations exist at all if the most modern agricultural techniques can't seem to make the jungle productive today? How did these large communities of the past manage to do it? The answer may be in the discovery of the mounds of black earth, or terra preta, as the Brazilians call it. It is dotted over many areas of the Amazon jungle. When scientists analyzed this terra preta, they discovered that it contained a mixture of common Amazon yellow soil and organic waste. This meant that it was man-made.
What we understand from ethnographic and archaeological evidence is that these soils formed as a result of very simple activities of burning litter, rubbish, the relocating of bits of soil into other places, and discard of charcoal from pottery production, fish bone, and all the rest.
The extraordinary thing about this black soil is how productive it is. It produces incredibly high yields.
If communities, rather than just plant and harvest the yields that would come out of very poor soils, were able to modify soils, then larger populations could be had, larger villages could be had, and hence larger societies could be had.
It does seem incredible that where we now can't do anything with the soil, this ancient civilization had brought about an agricultural miracle.
Existence of these large populations was predicated on the use of terra preta. It increases productivity in the same way that irrigation increases productivity in dry lands, or terraces increase productivity on mountainous lands.
Terra preta is so remarkable that scientists are now working out how to reproduce it so it can be used all over the world.
I think that what we're going to see is that it's going to play a major role in enhancing the productivity of small and medium-scale agriculture, and also to provide livelihoods and sustenance for rural populations in much of the world.
So Percy Fawcett was onto something. There really was a society out there that may well have had a great treasure to share with us. But it wasn't gold. As he himself had once written,
The answer to the enigma of ancient South America, and perhaps of the prehistoric world, may be found when those old cities are located and opened up to scientific research. That the cities exist, I know.
According to legend, he was Britain's greatest king.
The name of King Arthur resonates very deeply with the British.
King Arthur led his knights of the Round Table from Camelot, a vast, spectacular castle built on a hill. But was the legend of Camelot based on reality, or simply a myth?
It's a very fuzzy and vague place. It's glorious and it's glamorous.
If King Arthur really did exist, then the remains of his castle Camelot should lie buried somewhere in Britain. But where? In the 1960s, a team of archaeologists used the latest technology to try to prove the legend was real. They were led by Leslie Alcock, a brilliant, energetic showman who brought modern archaeology into the mainstream.
And in 1966, Leslie Alcock was one of the rock and roll archaeologists of his day.
Alcock identified a hill in Somerset, close to Glastonbury, as the most likely location for Camelot. But could he really prove it was the site of King Arthur's castle? If he succeeded, it would be one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The man who would lay claim to Camelot was born in Manchester in 1925. As a boy, Leslie Alcock was a brilliant student, determined to better himself both mentally and physically.
Dad seems to have been full of energy and drive. I found in his cycling diaries that he used to cycle 30 miles a day before going to school in the mornings. And you see that intellectually as well.
He won a scholarship to Manchester Grammar and then another to Brasenose College, Oxford. But his education was interrupted. During the Second World War, Alcock was posted to India, where he joined the 7th Gurkha Rifles. He became fascinated by the subcontinent's history and archaeology. He learnt that the past isn't just what people write in textbooks, but often something tangible, hidden in the ground. In India, he would eventually go on to work for one of Britain's most flamboyant archaeologists, Sir Mortimer Wheeler.
The story I'm telling you is not fantasy.
Wheeler's role was quite crucial in a way. One of the newspaper reporters said if he hadn't turned into a great archaeologist, he'd have been a matinee idol.
Moreover, we can relate this evidence.
He was an amazingly charismatic character.
Which, it is agreed...
It's towards the end of his active life, but nonetheless, boy, could he still carry it on. And, I mean, terrible old goat still.
Dad was invited by Sir Mortimer Wheeler to work at Mohenjo-Daro, this incredibly important dig into the centre of the Indus civilization. And I think he was taken on for a lot for his language skills, for his ability to get on with the locals, as much for his archaeological skills.
In 1946, Alcock returned to a very different Britain to the one he had left. Post-war, with its empire crumbling, the country was shattered, hungry, and in need of a lift. A country desperate for new heroes. In the early 1950s, morale was boosted by the British expedition's conquest of Everest. And Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile. Reminders that Britain could still be great.
He'd obviously used up his last ounce of energy, but what an achievement for Bannister and Britain.
But there was one hero from the past people turned to more than any other.
The modern growth of Arthur is something that happened after the Second World War, when people were thinking more about national roots, how they came to be so, and so forth.
There was a resurgence of interest in the Arthurian legends, I think primarily because King Arthur was seen as a figure who'd united his country in order to fight off Germanic invaders.
King Arthur was known as the once and future king. Legend said he would rise again and restore Britain to greatness.
Part of the story is that Arthur is not really dead. He's in the Isle of Avalon, or he's in a cave asleep, or somewhere. And the idea grew up that somehow or other Arthur would return and there would be a new golden age in Britain.
Such was the fascination with King Arthur. Post-war historians and archaeologists wanted to prove the legend was based on facts, not just myth, and that Britain's very identity was forged under the blade of the mighty king. King Arthur was supposed to have ruled in the Dark Ages, around 500 AD. He was said to have been born on the Cornish Isle of Tintagel, under the watchful eye of the wizard Merlin. The story goes that Arthur became the true king of the Britons, as only he could draw the sword Excalibur that had been set in stone. He valiantly defeated invaders who came across the sea from Europe, and in one battle, single-handedly killed 960 men.
He unified his country from warring factions. He defended it against invaders. He led a band of knights, the Knights of the Round Table, who were famous for their adventures, for finding the Holy Grail and rescuing damsels in distress.
And at the heart of the legend lies Camelot, Arthur's magnificent castle.
Sometimes it's said to have been built and designed by Merlin the magician. It's impregnable, it never falls to invaders, having several rings of walls around a central keep with great gatehouses and towers on them.
It's got to be a suitable place for a glorious king and his glorious court. So it's rich, it's towering ramparts, it's horses which are clad in marvellous armours and people in beautiful robes, all being very gracious. It's a fabulous place.
But separating the legend of Camelot from real history was almost impossible, because people weren't writing about events in Dark Age Britain. In fact, there were no history books at all. So there's no record of King Arthur or Camelot at the time. The first mention of Arthur was not until the 9th century, 300 years after he was supposed to have lived, in a book called the Historia Brittonum.
Historia Brittonum told a story about a historical Arthur who conducted a series of battles against the Anglo-Saxons and emerged from these battles as the great victor. The Arthur of Historia Brittonum isn't a king. He is given a title, Dux Bellorum, which just means the battle leader or war leader.
However, there is no mention of Camelot in the Historia Brittonum. But academics reasoned that a great war leader must have led from a great castle of some kind. Camelot the castle doesn't appear until the 12th century, when a writer called Geoffrey of Monmouth first mentions it, as well as King Arthur's magnificent Round Table. He depicted Arthur's court as a place of chivalry, where the king treated all knights as equals.
Geoffrey of Monmouth concocted his History of the Kings of Britain. This has its centrepiece, the life and career of King Arthur. It's the first place where, for example, his wife, Queen Guinevere, is mentioned, his fabulous court, his amazing weapons.
Thanks to Geoffrey of Monmouth, the legend of King Arthur and Camelot was born.
The idea that Arthur had a great castle as his court became increasingly inextricable from the legend of Arthur and his knights, who could now be seated around a round table in a magnificent castle.
But because the King Arthur of legend existed in the Dark Ages, not the Middle Ages, when the texts were written, there was no way of proving through recorded history alone that he actually lived. In fact, because recorded history was so scant, it was not until the 20th century that archaeologists began piecing together the story of Dark Age Britain, after the Romans had left, a time of supposed chaos and barbarism. The idea formed that maybe archaeology could offer answers where the history books had failed. And just maybe, the remains of King Arthur's great castle could be found, buried deep beneath the ground. It became one of the century's great quests of popular archaeology. When Leslie Alcock was growing up, one of the first to pioneer the new search for what was now being called Arthur's Britain was archaeologist Raleigh Radford. For 5 years, he excavated around the ruins of Arthur's legendary birthplace and what some believed had been his castle, the Isle of Tintagel in Cornwall. What he found were pottery fragments from half a world away. Fragments that completely contradicted notions of the Dark Ages. Incredibly, these fragments were from storage jars that once contained the luxury goods of their day, like wine and olive oil.
The importance of the Mediterranean pottery is it actually showed links with the late Roman world. To have this material suddenly coming in and recognized as being from dated contexts in the Mediterranean, it was a bolt of light.
Radford's pottery showed that rather than being chaotic, leaderless and isolated, some Dark Age Britons were actually very different.
Raleigh Radford, with these fragments of high-status pottery, was demonstrating that far from a lapse into barbarism, a break with Rome, Roman traditions, Roman civilization and culture had still been continued by the Britons in the face of the invading Saxons.
Radford's discoveries raised the extraordinary question. If Dark Age Britons were trading in luxury goods, who would they have been destined for, if not a king or leader of some kind? Could Tintagel have been a receiving port for a leader in the west of Britain, where King Arthur supposedly reigned? Because of Radford's pioneering work, excitement grew that maybe King Arthur really had existed, and that archaeology might even turn up something with his name on it. Perhaps the mighty sword Excalibur, or the remains of the Round Table, maybe even Camelot itself. Among those profoundly influenced by Radford's discoveries was Leslie Alcock, who in the 1950s was an assistant lecturer in archaeology at Cardiff University. On his first major dig, Alcock stumbled across the Dark Ages, almost by accident.
He started digging at a site called Dinas Powys, just outside Cardiff, and he did that as a thinking that he was going to be dealing essentially with an Iron Age site.
To his great surprise, Alcock was able to prove the Iron Age hill fort at Dinas Powys had been reoccupied in the Dark Ages, 1,000 years later. Alcock's excavation sparked an interest in post-Roman Britain that would define his career. By the 1960s, he became fascinated by new technology and techniques in archaeology that he believed might get to the bottom of the King Arthur myth once and for all. And what better way to start than finding the site of Arthur's legendary castle? But in a country with dozens of claims to be the original site of Camelot, working out where to dig was the biggest challenge of all.
For Dad, archaeology started very much before the digging. And what I always found was he was always looking in what was written. So much is taking the writings, which the historical record, and trying to find out if the historical record is true, or the places talked about in the historical record, can we identify them?
By examining every mention of the castle in the hundreds of stories that had been written about King Arthur, Alcock gradually picked out the main candidates. In the Middle Ages, Geoffrey of Monmouth and the Romance writers had said that Camelot lay in Caerleon, in Wales. But that was thought to be based on the presence of a Roman amphitheatre that looked like a giant round table. Another possible candidate was found in Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, published in 1485.
Sir Thomas Malory tried to ground his version of the Arthurian legends And he's very clear that Camelot isn't Winchester.
Mallory's theory was based on what was thought to be King Arthur's Round Table, which hangs in the Great Hall in Winchester. Carbon dating has in fact shown it was made for King Edward I, 700 years after King Arthur was supposed to have existed. But it was the writings of John Leyland, antiquary to King Henry VIII, that really piqued Alcock's interest. In 1542, Leyland wrote that a hill next to the village of South Cadbury in Somerset was the location of King Arthur's Camelot.
Leyland quite specifically dismisses all other candidates for Camelot except for Cadbury. He picks up the camel name from the local village names, Queen's Camel, places like that. Leyland sees in these very steep slopes and the ramparts there and the material, he gets almost orgiastic about how marvellous and how brilliant it all is.
Leyland said generations of locals had called the hill Camelot, a fact that had even drawn the attention of Alcock's mentor in India, Sir Mortimer Wheeler.
They said that their tradition was, they'd been told by their fathers and their grandfathers that King Arthur used to resort to this place, and it was known as Camelot or Camelot. That's the only real evidence we have, a local tradition. It's quite possible, I won't say more than that there is a little element of truth in this.
Local author Geoffrey Ashe, who had written several books on King Arthur, was so convinced that Cadbury could be Camelot, he approached Raleigh Radford, asking him to dig the site.
Cadbury is big. The enclosure at the top is 18 acres. Raleigh Radford was very much interested in Arthur, but when I asked him, could we excavate Cadbury, his response was, it's too big, I wouldn't know where to start.
But then Radford changed his mind, thanks to the findings of a dog walker on the hill at Cadbury, Mary Harefield.
She would go up there to walk her dog. The dog's name was Caesar, and she would walk about in ploughed-up fields there and poke about with the ferrule of an umbrella, which is the most elementary form of archaeology.
Mary Harefield turned up fragments of pottery that she thought was unusual and presented it to Raleigh Radford.
Mary Harefield's fragments were almost identical to Radford's finds at Tintagel.
Raleigh Radford, who had a vast experience of excavation throughout the West Country, immediately recognised as what he called Tintagelware. High-status tableware, high-status storage jars, fragments from the Eastern Mediterranean.
So oil, wine, and other luxuries had been sent up from Tintagel to Cadbury for someone of high status, exactly at the time that King Arthur was supposed to have lived. And these weren't the only clues that made Alcock and Radford want to excavate what could have been King Arthur's castle. Cadbury had clearly been fortified at some time, its banks ridged with earthen ramparts, possibly to protect a large army, just as Arthur was supposed to have led. And it was located just 11 miles from Glastonbury, with its Arthurian associations, and would have been on the front line in battles with invading Anglo-Saxons pushing west. Even the Ordnance Survey map used to call it Camelot. Radford, Alcock, and Wheeler staked their reputations on discovering Camelot at Cadbury. Failure to find it wasn't an option. In 1965, the Camelot Research Committee sat for the first time, tasked with the excavation of South Cadbury. Sir Mortimer Wheeler agreed to be president, offering advice from afar. Wheeler compared their quest to the late 19th century discovery of an ancient city, also thought to be entirely fictitious, until archaeology had proved otherwise.
One of the things which Sir Mortimer Wheeler was very, very keen to stress was that it was possible for archaeologists to discover legendary locations. He said if Heinrich Schliemann could find Troy, then why shouldn't English archaeologists be able to find Camelot?
The man who had started the search for King Arthur at Tintagel, Raleigh Radford, was the committee's chairman. The last surviving member of the committee today is Arthurian author Geoffrey Ashe.
Well, I was co-founder and I was secretary. I was the one who wasn't actually an archaeologist. I kept the minutes and things like that and handled the correspondence.
Leslie Alcock was the final committee member, selected as the outstanding Dark Age archaeologist of the day.
Leslie, because of his reputation as an excavator and his knowledge because of Dinas Powys, as well as his wider archaeological knowledge, was invited to come on board and appointed as Director of Excavations.
Unlike Radford, Alcock was undaunted by the scale of Cadbury.
I think it was the challenge of South Cadbury, which is what appealed to Leslie. It's a time of big projects. The BBC were digging Silbury Hill for the first time, and South Cadbury was going to be, if he got the money, a big project.
But on a hilltop of 18 acres, working out just where to start digging was in many ways more of a challenge than digging itself. Alcock was pioneering in his early use of geophysical surveying in deciding where to excavate.
It's often said that Leslie Alcock was one of the rock and roll archaeologists of his day. He was actually at the cutting edge of the white heat of technology. He used every technological means at his disposal to make sure that when they finally got picks and shovels out, they were digging in the right place.
Di Morgan Evans was a young supervisor on the search for Camelot, who was tasked with using the new technology.
One of the clinches there was the use of what became called the soil anomaly detector, and rather than calling it SAD, it was called the banjo.
17.
It looked like a banjo. It had a round disc at one end and a box at the other, connected by a long metal pole.
25.
What you had to do is you laid out 20-metre grids and you walked along calling out measurements at every few intervals.
31.
These were then written down by somebody. It became really repetitive, boring. It was awful.
But it wasn't just advanced technology Alcock deployed to work out where to dig. He was prepared to humour some of Geoffrey Ashe's New Age beliefs.
I use dowsing, sometimes called water divining, but it needn't be only water. It can detect other things. Leslie very generously allowed me to do it. Now, I think this was brave of him because we were working with the media breathing down our necks, and it could so easily have been made ridiculous to say that they're digging with dowsing rods.
Back at base, Alcock began to analyze the data from his geophysical surveys. He could tell the site was originally Iron Age, but could it have been reoccupied and refortified at the time of King Arthur? The banjo readings seemed to suggest so. There was only one way to know for sure.
When you're faced with a mass of preliminary evidence, there's only one way to resolve the problems and to sort it out, and that's to excavate.
But a dig of this scale needed a lot of money. The Camelot Research Committee had to somehow raise £15,000 to finance the excavation, the equivalent to almost £250,000 today. However, the committee knew just using the very word Camelot was guaranteed to get people's attention. In America, Camelot the musical had been the biggest show on Broadway. President Kennedy's Inner Circle had been named after Camelot. The name Camelot was on everyone's lips, capturing imaginations on both sides of the Atlantic.
Using the name Camelot was incredibly significant. Leslie Alcock was very keen to popularise archaeology, and the idea of King Arthur and Camelot might lead to an appreciation of history in these dark ages was important to him as a democratic way of explaining to beyond the elite of academia exactly what he was digging up.
With donations from the BBC, the Pilgrims Trust in America, and an exclusive deal with the Observer newspaper, finally the committee raised enough to begin the dig. But none of the archaeologists knew that one of the committee had personally taken a huge financial risk to ensure the excavation could proceed.
We were aware of the money constraints we had to spend. Leslie at times would get very twitchy, which doesn't surprise me because I only learnt later on that he, at one stage, he'd actually put up his house as security.
Leslie Alcock was a brilliant manager, a brilliant organiser, and considering the troubles he was up against, he was a very courageous man.
The dig for Camelot took place on the top of the hill and on the southern side, where a major trench was dug from top to bottom.
It was a time of really quite high tension because there was a need to deliver. It was a funny mixture of excitement, tension, and it used to come away absolutely wrung out and feeling like a wet dishcloth at the end of it.
Alcock's team catalogued all their discoveries. And hopes were dramatically raised when someone found an artifact in the shape of a letter.
All the letters it had to be in the alphabet, it was the letter A, and that, of course, caused huge excitement at the time.
The A had to stand for Arthur, surely proof of Cadbury's claims to Camelot. Alcock was so pleased with the find, he persuaded Sir Mortimer Wheeler to come and see Arthur's brooch. But after careful analysis, the A is discovered to be a Roman brooch, dating from before the Dark Ages. It couldn't possibly be Arthurian. Despite the setback, Alcock's team pressed on, their morale boosted by regular appearances of Sir Mortimer Wheeler.
He said to Leslie Alcock, "Dig there." Alcock dutifully did dig there and found things. Sir Mortimer was quite right, but he had an instinct by then, you know.
Alcock's other great mentor and collaborator, Raleigh Radford, would regularly visit the dig to check on developments.
Radford was sort of almost an amateur archaeologist in his own way, as a gentleman of independent means, although he was taken very seriously in some ways.
Raleigh Radford was an inspiration to a whole succeeding generation of archaeologists, and not surprisingly, Leslie Alcock started digging at a lot of the sites that Raleigh Radford had first drawn people's attention to.
Another regular visitor to the site was Alcock's son John.
I think South Cadbury was just very special. When you looked at the side of a trench, you're talking layer after layer of history. There's my dad standing beside saying to me, well, that's the medieval layer, that's the Dark Age layer.
The dig for Camelot was getting huge publicity. After 6 weeks of excavations, Alcock appeared on the BBC to explain their progress.
Well, we've now reached the end of our work in 1966, and both the traces of buildings that we found and the finds particularly give us every reason to believe that we've got a good site here of the 6th century AD in particular.
By now, interest in the dig had spread beyond Britain. Alcock needed to raise more money for further excavations and was given a huge boost by an unexpected source.
One evening, I was at home, the telephone rang, I picked it up, and the voice said, "This is Warner Brothers, where was Camelot?"
Camelot, the Broadway musical, was being turned into a major motion picture, starring Richard Harris and Vanessa Redgrave.
They wanted this for the film, you see. They were going to put a map in the film. So I said, it was in Somerset. Well, of course I said that. That's my one contribution to Hollywood.
For Leslie Alcock, Hollywood's interest was another great marketing opportunity.
You're talking about a time when Camelot had come out, when the Arthurian legend was a fascination to everyone, and my dad saw that by pushing that side of it, that this could be Camelot, he would get money to do the serious excavation. And what's more, by going to America, he could tap into a much bigger market with more money.
In the summer of 1967, the search for Camelot started up again. Thanks to the film, the committee raised enough funds, principally from America, to continue digging for another 3 summers.
Well, it's the time when flowers are coming from San Francisco. You've got Sgt. Pepper and Lonely Hearts Band. It's sort of the hippie era. It was all high degree of interest, and with the television cameras and the newspapers, and that it was all very, very buzzy.
The dig for Camelot went on for a further 3 years. As it drew to a close in 1970, Alcock made two extraordinary breakthroughs. His team found a late Roman coin of Dark Age origin, buried in the fortifications, that proved that the ramparts dated almost exactly to the time Arthur was supposed to have existed.
The eureka moment, if you like, where they realised that there was some substance to the legends which had got them digging, was discovering this wasn't only an Iron Age Celtic site that maybe some Saxons had lived on top of, but in the actual Arthurian period had been fortified, had been turned into an actual castle.
And if it was a Dark Age castle, who was to say it couldn't be Camelot? But then Alcock made an even more remarkable discovery: the remains of a great hall. A hall littered with Dark Age pot shards, almost certainly used for banqueting by a great ruler at the time of King Arthur. Maybe even Arthur himself.
At South Cadbury, there was a gigantic hall, a hall at least 20 feet across, that could easily have fitted something of the size and scale of the Round Table at Winchester, for example.
It was proof, surely, that Camelot lay at South Cadbury.
Here was my dad saying, actually, I'm the guy with the physical evidence. I've got the great big hall. You know, I've got something that is far more likely to be Arthur's Camelot than anything anyone else has found.
If the castle was surrounded by Dark Age fortifications and contained a great leader's feasting hall, it seemed King Arthur really could have ruled from Cadbury.
Are you yourself convinced that these were the defences of King Arthur himself?
Well, in my most cautious mood, I would only go this far to say that if it isn't Arthur himself, then it's another great military leader so like him that it doesn't make tons of difference.
Alcock and his team were triumphant. They basked in the knowledge that they had shown the legend of King Arthur and Camelot to be real after all. But, little by little, doubts about the dig at Cadbury started to emerge. Academics began to question Alcock's methods and his evidence.
There's nothing at South Cadbury which would make one believe that there was an Arthur in the 6th century than one did without it. In terms of finding evidence for a historical Arthur, it completely failed.
Every generation of archaeologists challenges those that went before it. They challenge their assumptions and they challenge their findings. That's the discipline of archaeology.
Believing that a war leader called Arthur led the Britons in their heroic defeat of the Anglo-Saxons in the 6th century is akin to believing that an Englishman in a dinner jacket called James Bond defeated the Soviet Union in the late 20th century.
The evidence for King Arthur's great hall on Cadbury was highly dubious at best, they said. It wasn't big enough for a round table at all.
It gets called a great hall, but to be honest, it's actually quite a small hall. An awful lot is placed on the shoulders of a really rather modest building.
Not only was there no archaeological evidence, even the historical texts, which Alcock had based his research on, were questionable, to say the least. The new skeptics dismantled the written foundation stone of Alcock's Arthurian claims. Rather than being a history, they said, the Historia Brittonum, which first mentioned Arthur, was a work of 9th century propaganda and had its chronology of the Dark Ages all wrong.
David Dunville's work in the 1970s completely discredited most of the evidence that Alcock and others supporting the idea of a historical Arthur had used. Obviously, this had a pretty negative impact on the credibility of Alcock's work.
Some hinted that Alcock had committed historical heresy. He had tried to give credibility to works of fiction rather than establish the truth. Even the very idea of Arthur, the heroic Briton, battling invading Anglo-Saxons was misconceived, they said.
Since the 1970s, the relationship between the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons has been increasingly reassessed, and we would now tend to think of that relationship as much more complicated and nuanced, if you like. Instead of continuous warfare and hostility, some Britons and some Anglo-Saxons lived peacefully side by side.
By the end of the 1990s, no serious historian dared associate the Dark Ages with a real King Arthur again, including Alcock himself. He had the great sense, rare among myth hunters, to accept that he was probably wrong.
I'm not aware of my dad taking criticisms hard. He always saw there was another argument. He always had some doubts as to whether Arthur existed. He always was prepared to accept there were other sides to the argument.
Despite his mistakes at Cadbury, in 1973, Alcock became the first professor of archaeology at Glasgow University and excavated Dark Age hill forts in Scotland with huge success. Alcock's legacy was not only furthering our understanding of Dark Age Britain, but also the lasting impact he had on the archaeologists he taught.
Without a doubt, Alcock's work encouraged an interest in Dark Age archaeology among a succeeding generation of archaeologists, most of whom are active today.
Leslie was a great teacher, a great academic, and I think he deserves more recognition than probably he gets. And I think in due course his contributions will be fully recognised, not least amongst the hundreds of students that he trained and sent out into the archaeological world.
You can't underestimate Leslie Alcock's contribution to the world of archaeology. This was a remarkable step change in the way that archaeology and the public interacted, and it's a legacy that we're still living under.
As for South Cadbury, the hill fort is now barely even signposted. Home just to cows and walkers, its association with King Arthur, once again, buried deep beneath the ground. And although he may not have found Camelot, Alcock had discovered the fortified remains of a great leader.
We certainly didn't find the Camelot of romance as you found it in the Middle Ages. We did find that the hill had been a great fortified place at exactly the right time.
And we now know South Cadbury Hill Fort was one of Britain's largest and most significant ancient settlements, occupied for 4,000 years, from Neolithic times until the Middle Ages.
Leslie Alcock's excavation at South Cadbury was, in many ways, a great success. It found an outstandingly useful sequence of occupation from a British hill fort.
And where does that leave the legend of King Arthur? Was he just a myth, after all?
I personally think that Arthur did exist, that as a Dux Bellorum he was a great military leader. Where he was, when he was, I can't be sure.
I think we can say that there was a real person. He is called King of the Britons.
Every nation needs its foundation myth, and Britain's is the legend of King Arthur and Camelot, a legend that lives on.